Part 1 Night on the Railway, the night of June 3 to 4, 1989. Central Russia, the Ufa region, more than 1,000 kilometers east of Moscow. The Siberian Railway runs through dense, dark forests, connecting Samara with Ufa, one of the oldest and busiest transport routes in the Soviet Union. The air that night smells of summer, but the earth and sky are still cold from the Ural Mountains. A weak wind blows through the pine forests, carrying the smell of grease and metal from the rails. Two passenger trains run parallel in the night, just a few minutes apart on two opposite tracks. One from Novosibirsk to Adler, heading toward the Black Sea. The other in the opposite direction, back to central Russia. In each car, a dim yellow light shines through the half-closed windows. The passengers had already begun to fall asleep, leaving only the rustling of blankets, the steady breathing of children, the sound of the guard walking lightly down the corridor, and the ticking of a small clock on the wall. In a car in the middle of the train, a few children were still awake, whispering about summer camp, hiding strawberry candy packets from each other. A young soldier looked out the window, saw the forest as dark as a velvet curtain, only occasionally flashing red from a distant railway signal. At the front of the train, the engine driver looked at his watch, checked the pressure gauge, and yawned. A peaceful night, a trip like thousands of others that had passed safely on this route for decades. No one knew that right below them, underground and parallel to the tracks, ran a giant liquid propane-butane pipeline, a blood vessel of the Soviet energy industry, hundreds of kilometers long, carrying fuel from the Orenburg mine to Ufa. Over the past few days, at a bend near kilometer 1710, the pipeline pressure had dropped slightly. A few engineers on night duty at the Shuchye pumping station noticed the anomaly. About a 5% drop, probably due to temperature changes. They wrote in their logbooks, then closed them. No one immediately asked to check because it was just a small number, and they had a long night ahead. In fact, at that bend, a microscopic crack had formed in the steel pipe due to corrosion and long-term vibration. Drops of cold liquid gas leaked out, vaporizing as they hit the ground, creating an invisible mist that crept along the valley floor. Propane was heavier than air, so it quietly seeped into the hollow between the two tracks where the grass grew thick, where the chirping of crickets drowned out human breathing. No one smelled anything. No one saw anything, just the night and silence. A few hundred meters away, a pack of stray dogs barked fiercely and ran away towards the forest. A guard on duty in a small hut next to the railway raised his head and looked around. He did not understand why the pressure gauge on the electric panel in the station showed a slight fluctuation, then returned to normal. He poured more tea, lit a cigarette, and thought about the upcoming vacation. None of them knew that in a few hours, the whole area from the forest to the rails, from the train to the pumping station, would disappear in a single spot of light. And before dawn, on the map of the Soviet Union, there would be a new blank space where there were no more villages, no more stations, no more traces of the people who had passed through that night. Part 2, Invisible Air Currents. Around 00:45 inches the morning. In the Ural sky, the stars were already fading in a thin mist. The night air was heavy, and there was a faint, pungent smell, something like gasoline or kerosene, which made some of the people living near the railway frown, but then they ignored it. They were used to such smells because there were always gas stations and small factories in the area. The wind changed direction, bringing with it a chill and silence. On the railway, a freight train had just passed through the area about 10 minutes ago. The freight train driver, an experienced man, pressed the radio button and reported to the control center. There is a strange smell of gas. West of the forest, near kilometers 1710. The message was recorded, hastily copied into the logbook, but was not forwarded to the two passenger trains heading to the same area. In the night watch room, the dispatcher yawned, added a few more numbers to his report, and leaned back in his chair. No one thought that this small signal was the final warning. At the gas station 11 kilometers away, the engineers began to review the pressure plate. The Orenburg-Ufa pipeline showed a slight oscillation, but the needle quickly returned to normal. Maybe it's the temperature difference, one of them said, sipping cold tea. They didn't know that out there. In the middle of the pine forest, thousands of cubic meters of propane were creeping down the slope, gathering in the hollows and trenches between the two tracks. Propane was heavier than air. It crept along the ground, layer by layer, silently filling every space. Between the pine stumps, the gas shimmered faintly in the moonlight, like silver mist. Not a single living thing remained in the hollow. Insects fell silent. The forest birds had fled. No one knew why the forest was so quiet at night. At the same time, two passenger trains were approaching each other from either end each, with more than 20 cars. Weighing thousands of tons, steel wheels grinding on the rails, diesel engines roaring softly in a steady rhythm. In the compartment, a few passengers were still awake, looking out the windows to see the red lights in the distance between the woods. When the two trains simultaneously entered the gas-filled valley, the wheels rubbed against the rails, creating small sparks. Under normal conditions, they were harmless, just a reaction of metal and friction. But tonight, they encountered an invisible ocean, a sea of propane gas floating, thick, just waiting for a small spark to turn the sky into apocalypse. Part 3, Moment. 1:14 a.m. Two trains were approaching each other on two parallel tracks, one heading south, the other heading north, only a few hundred meters apart. Neither of the two trains knew they were entering the center of a giant gas cloud, as thick as fog but completely invisible to the human eye. Sleep filled the compartment. Most of the passengers were families and children on summer vacation. In the seventh car of the southern train, a group of 13 to 14-year-old students had just turned off the lights, some still giggling before falling asleep. The iron wheels screeched. The rails hummed like the heartbeat of the night. Then, something almost invisible happened. A stream of propane gas was sucked up by the wind from the engine, mixed with the air, and met a tiny spark, maybe from the brakes, maybe from a contact between the wheels and the steel rails. Just a flash of light, and in that instant, the entire space between the two trains exploded. A blast tore through the night, thunderous, then beyond any sound humans had ever heard. In an instant, the ground shook, the sky lit up. A huge fireball rose nearly a kilometer high, so bright that people in villages more than 30 kilometers away thought it was the sun rising in the night forest. They recounted. We saw a second sun, red and huge, bursting out and engulfing the entire horizon. The pressure of the explosion was so strong that the shock waves spread for kilometers. Two trains were thrown like toys. The middle car of the northern train, the one with the most children, was blown off the track, falling into the forest and exploding a second time when the diesel fuel caught fire. Other cars twisted, falling on top of each other. The curved pieces of steel burned red like melted candles. The remaining train, swept by the main fire, was completely ablaze. The flames traveled from front to back in seconds, licking through each compartment, swallowing the air. Glass shattered, curtains caught fire, luggage burned. Those near the epicenter died instantly without seeing or understanding what was happening. In the cars further away, survivors recounted. We heard a long, long whistle. Then the sky was red. The wind blew out the windows, and the heat hit like a wall of fire. No one had time to think. There were only screams, children calling for their mothers, and the smell of burning everywhere. Some people jumped from the burning cars, running into the darkness, rolling down the ditches. But the ground was also on fire. The propane gas, which had not yet dissipated, still covered the forest, igniting from hundreds of different points. Grass, trees, air, everything was on fire. Tiny sparks flickered on the ground like thousands of ghostly petals, spread across the forest slopes, dancing in the hot wind. Against the black sky, the fireball still rolled, reflected in the small river nearby, as if the forest, the earth, the sky were all on fire at once. Part 4. Fire and Darkness. 3 a.m. The siren of a fire engine rang out in the forest night, shrill and hopeless. The first fire brigade from Ufa had just arrived, and they stopped. Before them was no longer a railway, but a sea of fire burning in the night, so red that the sky reflected it like a false dawn. Two trains lay parallel in the middle of the forest, now nothing more than twisted, red-hot metal, melted like candle wax. The steel rails were twisted and twisted as if crushed by some giant hand. The temperature was estimated to be over 1,200 degrees Celsius, enough to melt steel, vaporize plastic, and melt the ground. The steel joints of the wheels melted, flowing into a silvery stream in the fire, then cooling into streaks of frozen metal on the ground. Thick black smoke billowed hundreds of meters into the air, mixing with steam and ash, forming a column of burning cloud that stretched to the horizon. The firefighters could not get close. They tried to move forward, but the heat was so intense that their protective masks melted, and the hoses steamed before they could reach the flames. Many survivors were still trapped inside the cars that had not collapsed, pounding on the doors, calling for help in desperation. But if the doors opened, the wind would whip the flames like knives. A fire officer, years later, tearfully said, "We heard people screaming, but we couldn't take another step. Another meter and we would have died." The fire engulfed an area of more than 250 hectares, forest, rails, train, and even a small ditch next to it. Those who escaped were burned or suffocated by smoke, many without clothes, only charred skin. A 1-2-year-old boy jumped out of the train car and fell into the ditch. He sat there all night, hugging his knees, watching the fire burn until dawn. When he was rescued, he did not say a word for many days. His eyes were empty, as if he had seen something that could not be described in words. More than 30 fire trucks and 400 people from neighboring areas were mobilized. They had to put out the fire layer by layer, each section of rail, spraying water and digging trenches to prevent the fire from spreading into the deep forest. It was not until nearly 7 a.m. that the fire gradually weakened, leaving only thin columns of smoke rising from the charred train. When dawn finally broke, the sun shone down on a scene that resembled a post-bombing battlefield. Blackened skeletons of wagons, twisted iron wheels, and a thick layer of ash mixed with sand and burnt clothing on the ground. Heat still rose from the cracks. Firefighters walked slowly, heads bowed, among the rubble. They could no longer find people, only the faint outlines of what had once been life, now charred and silent. Part 5. Dawn in the Ashes. June 4, the morning after the disaster. The sun had just risen, its weak light filtering through the gray smoke still rising from the charred wagons. The air was thick with the acrid smell of plastic, diesel, and burnt flesh. The entire forest was now a sprawling ash field where the once bustling Samara-Ufa railway line had been. Amid the hum of soldiers and ambulances, no one spoke much, only a heavy, suffocating silence. Police, military, forensic doctors, and hundreds of rescue workers fanned out across the scene. They numbered every carriage, every body, every piece of clothing. The death toll was mounting so quickly that the records were running out of time. 575 people were killed. More than 800 were injured. Among them were more than 300 children sent away on vacation, with small suitcases, hats embroidered with the camp name, and unsent postcards. It became the worst railway disaster in the entire history of the Soviet Union. The news spread around the world in a matter of hours, but domestically, television broadcast only a brief, cold report. A serious accident has occurred near Ufa. Authorities are investigating the cause. No photographs, no list of victims. The press was barred from the scene. Only the locals, the first to see the fire, silently built wooden fences, planted wildflowers, placed teddy bears and school photos on the ashes. Mothers wept beside the charred tracks, clutching small bags of ash that they said were the remains of their children. One woman, her face covered in coal dust, sobbed, "I took my child on a summer trip. Now I'm taking his ashes home." The investigation took weeks. When engineers arrived, they found a 1.5-meter, 5-foot section of steel pipe torn off the ground right where the explosion occurred. The pressure inside had risen too high over the previous 14 hours without being noticed, because the safety valve was stuck and the pressure monitoring system had not been checked regularly. The propane and butane gas had accumulated along the valley floor, right where the two trains passed. The explosion occurred at the fateful moment. When both convoys entered the dense gas zone, the concentration reached the perfect explosive level, and a small spark from the braking system became the trigger. A moment shorter than a breath, and the whole land was wiped off the map. One deviation, one crack, one delay in reading the index, and 575 lives were lost. That night, the Ural sky lit up not by dawn, but by the fire of human indifference. Part 6, The Final Silence. The Soviet government immediately issued an emergency order. The entire gas pipeline network in the territory was to be inspected immediately. More than 2,000 kilometers of pipelines were inspected over the course of several months. Hundreds of safety valves were replaced. Pumping stations were equipped with automatic leak warning systems. Hundreds of pages of reports were sent to Moscow with the chilling conclusion: cause technical failure and lack of supervision. But for those who lost their husbands, their children, their entire families on that night of June 4, all the numbers were meaningless. No document could replace a hug, a call, a hand that had disappeared in the fire. Many years later, on the old foundation of the railway, the locals erected a black steel monument. Two trains curved, facing each other. Between them, a red flame rising straight up into the sky, a symbol of the fateful moment when the two trains met and the sky exploded. The inscription on the stele was simple but haunting: for those who passed through the night of June 4. Every year, on that day, survivors and relatives of the victims return. They light candles along the old tracks, the flames trembling in the night wind. No one speaks loudly. Only the wind blows through the pine trees, and in the distance, the sound of the train echoes like a memorial. A petroleum engineer who worked at the pumping station that year recounts, his voice quiet as if confessing, "We saw a drop in pressure, signs of a leak, but we thought we would deal with it tomorrow morning. That night, I learned that sometimes tomorrow never comes." The Ufa disaster was more than a technical accident. It was a warning etched into the memory about complacency, about the false belief that everything is fine until nothing is. It was a lesson paid in blood, in fire, and in 575 lives. Years later, the railway was restored. The new tracks were shiny, the safety controls were stricter, the gas station was rerouted away from residential areas. Trains ran through what had once been the dead zone, and people tried to forget the old memories. But for those who witnessed it, time could not erase the image of the night sky, suddenly turning into a sea of fire. One survivor, then 14 years old, wrote in his diary, "For a second, everything was quiet. Then the light was so great that I thought the sun had risen in the middle of the night. But no, that was the moment our world was erased." From then on, people around the area no longer called the place the Samara-Ufa line. They called it by a name that carried with it both pain and memory: Fire Field,